to Red Raspberry ASMR. Tonight our book is called To Sir Phillip with Love by Julia Quinn. So this is one of the Bridgerton novels. I actually read all of these and they were okay. They're kind of the same book over and over again, but they're an easy read if you're just looking for something cute and quick. But we'll dive into the summary and you can decide for yourself. She wrote him a letter and he stole her heart. Sir Philip knew that Eloise Bridgerton was a spinster, and so he'd proposed, figuring that she'd be homely and unassuming and more than a little desperate for an offer of marriage, except she wasn't. The beautiful woman on his doorstep was anything but quiet, and when she stopped talking long enough to close her mouth, all he wanted to do was kiss her, and more. Did he think she was mad? Eloise Bridgerton couldn't marry a man she'd never met, but she started thinking and wondering, and before she knew it, she was in a hired carriage in the middle of the night on her way to meet the man she hoped might be her perfect match, except he wasn't. Her perfect husband wouldn't be so moody and ill-mannered, and while Philip was certainly handsome, he was a large brute of a man, rough and rugged and totally unlike the London gentleman vying for her hand. But when he smiled and when he kissed her, the rest of the world simply fell away, and she couldn't help but wonder, could this imperfect man be perfect for her? I'm sure you can see where this is going. Alright, let's dive into chapter 1. Prologue, February 1823, Gloucester, England. It was ironic, really, that it had happened on such a sunny day. The first sunny day in what had been 6 straight weeks of gray skies, accompanied by the occasional sprinkling of light snow or rain. Even Philip, who thought himself impervious to the vagaries of the weather, had felt his spirits lighten, his smile widen. He'd gone outside, and he'd had to. No one could remain indoors during such a splendid display of sunshine, especially in the middle of such a gray winter. Even now, more than a month after it had happened, he couldn't quite believe that the sun had the temerity to tease him so. And how was it that he'd been so blind that he'd not expected it? He lived with Marina since the day of their marriage, 8 long years, to know the woman. He should have expected it, and in truth he had expected it. He just hadn't wanted to admit the expectation. Perhaps he was just trying to delude himself, protect himself even, to hide from the obvious, hoping that if he didn't think about it, it would never happen. But it did, and on a sunny day to boot. God certainly had a sick sense of humor. He looked down at his glass of whiskey, which was quite inexplicably empty. He must have drunk the damn thing, and yet he had no memory of doing so. He didn't feel woozy, at least not as woozy as he should have been, or even as woozy as he wanted to be. He stared out the window at the sun, which was slipping low on the horizon. It had been another sunny day today. That probably explained his exceptional melancholy, at least he hoped it did. He wanted an explanation, needed one for this awful tiredness that seemed to be taking over. Melancholy terrified him. More than anything, more than fire, more than war, more than hell itself. The thought of sinking into sadness, of being like her. Marina had been melancholy. Marina had spent her entire life, or at least the entire life he'd known melancholy. He couldn't remember the sound of her laughter, and in truth, he wasn't sure that he'd ever known it. It had been a sunny day, and he squeezed his eyes shut, not certain whether the motion was meant to urge the memory or dispel it. It had been a sunny day, and never thought you'd feel the likes of that on your skin again, eh, Sir Philip? Philip Crane turned his face to the sun, closing his eyes as he let the warmth spread over his skin. It's perfect, he murmured, or it would be if it weren't so bloody cold. Miles Carter, his secretary, chuckled. It's not as cold as that. The lake hasn't frozen this year, just a few patchy spots. Reluctantly, Philip turned away from the sun and opened his eyes. It isn't spring, though. If you were wishing for spring, sir, perhaps you should have consulted a calendar. Philip regarded him with a sideways glance. Do I pay you for such impertinence? Indeed, and handsomely, too. Philip smiled to himself as both men paused to enjoy the sun for a few moments longer. I thought you didn't mind the gray, Miles said conversationally once they resumed their trek to Philip's greenhouse. I don't, Philip said, striding along with the confidence of a natural athlete. But just because I don't mind an overcast sky doesn't mean I don't prefer the sun. He paused, thought for a moment. Be sure to tell Nurse Millsby to take the children outside today. They'll need warm coats, of course, and hats and mittens and the like, but they ought to get a little sun on their faces. They've been cooped up for too long. As we all have, Miles murmured. Philip chuckled. Indeed. He glanced over his shoulder at his greenhouse. He probably ought to take care of his correspondence now, but he had some seeds he needed to sort through, and truly, there was no reason he couldn't conduct his business with Miles in an hour or so. Go on, he said to Miles. Fine, Nurse Millsby. You and I can deal later. You know you hate the greenhouse anyway. Not this time of year, Miles said. The heat is rather welcome. Philip arched a brow as he inclined his head towards Romney Hall. Are you calling my ancestral home drafty? All ancestral homes are drafty. True enough, Philip said with a grin. He rather liked Miles. He hired him 6 months earlier to help with the mountains of paperwork and details that seemed to accumulate from running his small property. Miles was quite good, young, but good, and his dry sense of humor was certainly welcome in a house where laughter was never in abundance. The servants would never dare joke with Philip and Marina, and it went without saying that Marina did not laugh or tease. The children sometimes made Philip laugh, but that was a different sort of humor, and besides, most of the time he didn't know what to say to them. He tried, but he felt too awkward, too big, too strong, if such a thing were possible. And then he just found himself shooing them off, telling them to go back to their nurse. It was easier that way. Go on then, Philip said, sending Miles off on a task he probably should have done himself. He hadn't seen his children yet today, and he supposed he ought to, but he didn't want to spoil the day by saying something stern, which he inevitably seemed to do. He'd find them while they were off on their nature walk with Nurse Millsby. That would be a good idea. Then he could point out some sort of plant and tell them about it, and everything would remain perfectly simple and benign. Philip entered his greenhouse and shut the door behind him, taking a welcome breath of the moist air. He studied botany at Cambridge, taken a first even, and in truth he'd probably have taken up on academic life if his older brother had not died at Waterloo, thrusting the second-born Philip into the role of landowner and country gentleman. He supposed it could have been worse. He could have been a landowner and a city gentleman after all. At least here he was able to pursue his botanical pursuits in relative serenity. He bent over his workbench, examining his latest project, a strain of peas that he was trying to breed to go fatter and plumper in the pot. No luck yet, though. This latest batch was not just shriveled, but had even turned yellow, which had not been the expected results at all. Philip frowned, then allowed himself a small smile as he moved to the back of the greenhouse to gather his supplies. He never minded too terribly when his experiments did not produce the expected outcome. In his opinion, necessity had never been the mother of invention. Accidents. It was all about accidents. No scientist would admit it, of course, but most great invention occurred while one was attempting to solve some other problem entirely. He chuckled as he swept the shriveled peas aside. At this rate, he'd gear gout by the end of the year. Back to work, back to work. He bent over his seed collection, smoothing them out so he could examine them all. He just needed the right one for... He looked up and out at the freshly washed glass. A movement across the field caught his eye, a flash of red. Philip smiled to himself as he shook his head. It must be Marina. Red was her favorite color, something that he always found odd. Anyone who'd spent time with her would have surely thought she preferred something darker, more somber. He watched as she disappeared into the wooded copse and then got back to work. It was rare for Marina to venture outside. These days she didn't often leave the confines of her bedchamber. Philip was happy to see her out in the sun, Maybe it would restore her spirits. Not completely, of course. Philip didn't think even the sun had the ability to do that. But maybe a bright, warm day would be enough to draw her out for a few hours and bring a small smile to her face. Heaven knew the children could use that. They visited their mother in her room almost every evening, but it wasn't enough, and Philip knew that this lack was not made up for by him. He sighed, a wave of guilt rushing over him. He was not the sort of father they needed, and he knew that. He tried to tell himself that he was doing his best, that he was succeeding in what his only goal was when it came to parenthood, that he not behave in the manner of his own father, but still, he knew it wasn't enough. With resolute motions, he pushed himself away from his workbench. The seeds could wait. His children probably could wait too, but that didn't mean they should. And he ought to take them on their nature walk, not Nurse Millsby, who didn't know a deciduous tree from a coniferous, and most likely tell them that a rose was a daisy, and he glanced out the window again, reminding himself that it was February. Nurse Millsby wasn't likely to locate any sort of flower in this weather. But still, it didn't excuse the fact that he ought to take the children on their nature walk. It was the one sort of children's activity at which he truly excelled, and he could not shirk the responsibility. He rose out of the greenhouse, but then stopped, not even a third of the way back to Romney Hall. If he was going to fetch the children, he ought to take them out to see their mother. They craved her company, even when she did nothing more than pat them on the head. Yes, they should find Marina. That would be even more beneficial than a nature walk. But he knew from experience that he ought not make assumptions about Marina's state of mind. Just because she ventured outside did not mean that she was feeling well, and he hated when the children saw her in one of her moods. Philip turned around and headed out toward the copse where he had seen Marina disappear just a few moments earlier. He walked with nearly twice the speed of Marina. It wouldn't take very long to catch her up and assert her mood. He could be back at the nursery before the children set out with Nurse Millsby. He walked the path through the woods, easily following Marina's path. The ground was moist, and Marina must have been wearing heavy boots because her prints had sunk into the earth with clear definition. They led down the slight incline and out of the woods and then onto a grassy patch. Damn, Philip muttered, the word barely audible as the wind picked up around him. It was impossible to see her footprints on the grass. He used his hand to shade his eyes from the sun and scanned the horizon, looking for the telltale scrap of red. Not near the abandoned cottage, nor at Philip's field of experimental grains, nor at the large boulder that Philip had spent so many hours clambering upon when he was a child. He turned north, his eyes narrowing when he finally saw her. She was headed toward the lake. The lake? Philip's lips parted as he stared down at her form, moving slowly towards the water's edge. He wasn't quite frozen. It was more that he was suspended. As his mind took in this strange sight, Marina didn't swim. He didn't even know if she could. He supposed that she was aware that there was a lake on the grounds, but in truth he'd never known her to go there, not in the 8 years they had been married. He started walking toward her, his feet somehow recognizing what his mind refused to accept. As she stepped into the shallows, he picked up the speed, still too far away to do anything but call out her name. But if she heard him, she made no indication, just continued her slow, steady progress into the depths. Marina, he screamed, now breaking into a run. He was still a good minute away, even moving at top speed. Marina! She reached the point where the bottom dropped off, and she dropped off too, disappearing under the gunmetal gray of the surface, her red cloak floating around the top for a few seconds before being sucked in under her. He yelled her name again, and even though she couldn't possibly hear, he skidded and stumbled down the hill leading to the lake, then had just enough presence of mind to yank off his coat and boots before diving into the freezing cold water. She had been barely under a minute. His mind recognized that this was probably not enough time to drown, but every second it took him to find her was another second toward her death. He'd swum the lake countless times, knew exactly where the bottom dropped off, and he reached that critical point with swift, even strokes, barely noticing the drag of the water against his heavy clothes. He could find her. He had to find her before it was too late. He dove down, his eyes scanning the murky mocked water. Marina must have kicked up some of the sand from the bottom, and he had surely done the same. because the fine silt was swirling around him, the puffy, opaque clouds making it difficult to see. But in the end, Marina was saved by her one colorful quirk, and Philip pumped through the water down to the bottom, where he saw the red of her cloak floating through the water like a glorious kite. She did not fight him as he pulled her to the surface. Indeed, she had already lost consciousness and was nothing more than a dead weight in his arms. They broke out into the air, and he took great big gasps to fill his burning lungs. For a moment, he could do nothing but breathe, his body recognizing that it had to save itself before he could save anyone else. Then he pulled her along to the shore, careful to keep her face above water, even though she didn't seem to be breathing. Finally, they reached the water's edge, and he dragged her upon the narrow strip of dirt and pebbles that separated the water from the grass. With frantic movements, he felt in front of her face for air, but there was none emerging from her lips. He didn't know what to do. Hadn't thought he'd ever have to save someone from drowning, so he just did what seemed most sensible and heaved her on for his lap, face down, whacking her on the back. Nothing happened at first, but after the fourth violent thrust, she coughed. A stream of murky water erupted from her mouth. He turned her over quickly. "Marina?" he asked, urgently, lightly slapping her face. "Marina?" She coughed again, her body racked by spastic tremors. Then she began to suck in air, her lungs forcing her to live even when her soul desired something else. "Marina," Philip said, his voice shaking with relief. Thank God. He didn't really love her, had never really loved her, but she was his wife, and she was the mother of his children, and she was, deep down, beneath her unshakable cloak of sorrow and despair, a good and fine person. He may not have loved her, but he did not want her death. She blinked, her eyes unfocused, and then finally she seemed to realize where she was, who he was, and she whispered, "No." "I've got to get you back to the house," he said gruffly, startled by how angry he was over that single word. No. How dare she refuse his rescue? Would she give up on life just because she was sad? Did her melancholy amount to more than their 2 children? And the balance of life did bad mood weigh more than their need for a mother? "I'm taking you home," he bit out, heaving her none too gently in his arms. She was breathing now and clearly in possession of her faculties. Misguided though they may be, there was no need to treat her like a delicate flower. "No," she sobbed quietly. "Please don't. I don't. You're going home," he stated, trudging up the hill, oblivious to the chill wind turning his sodden clothes to ice, oblivious even to the rocky soil pressing into his unshod feet. "I can't," she whispered with what seemed like her last ounce of energy. As Philip carried his burden home, all he could think about was how apt those words were. "I can't." In a way, it seemed to sum up her entire life. By nightfall, it became apparent that fever might succeed where the lake had failed. Philip had carried Marina home as quickly as he was able, and with the aid of Mrs. Hurley, his housekeeper, had stripped her of her icy garments and tried to warm her beneath the goose-down quilt that had been the centerpiece of her trousseau for 8 years earlier. "What happened?" Mrs. Hurley had gasped when he staggered through the kitchen door. He hadn't wanted to use the main entrance where he might be seen by his children, and besides, the kitchen door was closer by a good 20 yards. "She fell into the lake," he said gruffly. Mrs. Hurley gave him a look that was somehow dubious and sympathetic all at the same time, and he knew that she knew the truth. She had worked from the Cranes since their marriage. She knew Marina's moods. She had shooed him out of the room once they had Marina in bed, insisting that he change his own clothing before he caught his death as well. He had returned, though, to Marina's side. That was his place as her husband, and he thought guiltily a place he had avoided in recent years. It was depressing to be with Marina. It was hard. But now wasn't the time to shirk his duties, and so he sat at her bedside throughout the day and the night. He mopped her brow when she began to perspire, tried to pour lukewarm broth down her throat when she was calm. He told her to fight even though he knew his words fell on deaf ears. 3 days later, she was dead. It was what she'd wanted, but that was a little comfort as Philip faced his children, twins just turned 7 years old, and tried to explain that their mother was gone. He sat in their nursery, his large frame too big for any of their tot-sized chairs. But he sat anyway, twisted like a pretzel, and forced himself to meet their gazes as he reached out the words. They said little, which was unlike them, but they didn't look surprised, which Philip found disturbing. I'm sorry, he choked out when she reached the end of his speech. He loved them so much, and he filled them in so many ways. He barely knew how to be a father to them. How in hell was he meant to take on the role of mother as well? It's not your fault, Oliver said, his brown eyes capturing his father's with an intensity that was unsettling. She fell in the link, didn't she? You didn't push her. Philip only nodded, unsure of how to respond. Is she happy now? Amanda asked softly. I think so, Philip said. She gets to watch you all the time now from heaven, so she must be happy. The twins seemed to consider that for quite some time. I hope she's happy, Oliver finally said, as his voice more resolute than his expression. Maybe she won't cry anymore. Philip felt his breath catch in his throat. He hadn't realized that they had heard Marina's sobs. She only seemed to sink so low late at night. Their room was directly above hers, but he'd always assumed they'd already fallen asleep when their mother started to cry. Amanda nodded her agreement, her little blonde head bobbing up and down. If she's happy now, she said, then I'm glad she's gone. She's not gone, Oliver cut in. She's dead. No, she's gone, Amanda persisted. It's the same thing. Philip said flatly, wishing he had something to tell them other than the truth, but I think she's happy now. In a way, that was the truth, too. It was what Marina had wanted, after all. Maybe it was all she had wanted all along. Amanda and Oliver were quiet a long while. Both kept keeping their eyes on the floor as their legs swung from their perch on Oliver's bed. They looked so small, sitting there on a bed that was clearly too high for them. Philip frowned. How was it that he had never noticed this before? Shouldn't they be on lower beds? What if they fell off in the night? Or maybe they were too big for that. Maybe they didn't fall out of bed any longer. Maybe they never had. Maybe he truly was an abominable father. Maybe he should know these things. Maybe. He closed his eyes and sighed. Maybe he should stop thinking quite so much and simply try his best and be happy with that. Are you going to go away? Amanda asked, raising her eyes. He looked into her eyes, so blue, so like her mother's. No, he whispered fiercely, kneeling before her and taking his tiny hands in his own. They looked so small in his grasp, so fragile. No, he repeated, I'm not going away. I'm not ever going away. Philip looked down at his whiskey glass. It was empty again. Funny how a whiskey glass could go empty even after one filling it 4 times. He hated remembering. He wasn't sure what was worse. Was it the dive underwater or the moment Mrs. Hurley had turned to him and said, she's gone? Or was it his children, the sorrow on their faces, the fear in their eyes? He lifted the glass to his lips, letting the final drop slide into his mouth. The worst part was definitely his children. He told them he wouldn't ever leave them, and he hadn't. He wouldn't, but his simple presence wasn't enough. They needed more. They needed someone who knew how to be a parent, who knew how to speak to them and understand them and get them to mind and behave. And since he couldn't very well get them another father, he supposed he ought to think about finding them a mother. It was too soon, of course. He couldn't marry anyone until his prescribed period of mourning was complete, but that didn't mean he couldn't look. He sighed, something in his seat. He needed a wife. Almost any wife would do. He didn't care what she looked like. He didn't care if she had money. He didn't care if she could do sums in her head or speak French or even ride a horse. She just had to be happy. Was that so much to want in a wife? A smile at least once a day, maybe even the sound of her laughter? And she had to love his children, or at least pretend so well that they never knew the difference. It wasn't so much to ask for, was it? Philip looked up, cursed himself for having left his study door slightly ajar. Miles Carter, his secretary, was poking his head in. What is it? A letter, sir, Miles said, walking forward to hand him an envelope from London. Philip looked down at the envelope in his hands, his brows rising at the obviously feminine slant to the handwriting. He dismissed Miles with a nod, then picked up his letter opener and slid it under the wax. A single sheet of paper slipped out. Philip rubbed it between his fingers. High quality, expensive, heavy too, a clear sign that the sender need not economize to reduce drinking costs. Then he turned it over and read, Number 5, Bretton Street, London. Sir Philip Crane, I am writing to express my condolences on the loss of your wife, my dear cousin Marina. Although it has been many years since I last saw Marina, I remember her fondly and was deeply saddened to hear of her passing. Please do not hesitate to write if there's anything I can do to ease your pain at this difficult time. Yours, Miss Eloise Bridgerton. Philip rubbed his eyes. Bridgerton. Did Marina have Bridgerton cousins? She must have done if one of them was sending him a letter. He sighed, then surprised himself by reaching for his own stationery and quill. He had received precious few condolence notes since Marina had died. It seemed most of her friends and family had forgotten her since her marriage. He supposed he shouldn't be upset or even surprised. She rarely left her bedchamber. It was easy to forget about someone no one ever saw. Miss Bridgerton deserved a reply. It was common courtesy, and even if it wasn't, and Philip was quite certain he didn't know the full etiquette of one's wife dying, it still seemed somehow the right thing to do. And so, with a weary breath, he put his quill to paper. And that is the first sad bit to Sir Philip with love. So let me know what you thought about this one and what you think about the other Bridgerton books if you've read them. And let me know what you think we should read next. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one. So I hope you have a good night. Good night.